Have you ever been shot in the head? It's something I have, and I wouldn't suggest it. It's actually quite a bit of psychedelic. Upon witnessing my potential killer pull out his gun from his waistband, chamber it, and place it in the barrel towards my face, I experienced a sense of familiarity. The moment he spoke, I had never heard anyone so attentively in my entire life, and I used all my physical and mental abilities to force them out of my mind when they asked me questions. I felt as though I had an aneurysm in my chest after glancing at the gun, which was similar to the golden lacer that women use for concealment. Following my brief introduction of the upcoming story, many of you may have wondered how you managed to get a gun pointed at your face. It's time to inform you. I'm currently working a night shift at shabby motel near Winnington, Illinois. My two best friends were able to purchase tickets for Lollapalooza the previous year, but my financial situation prevented me from purchasing a bus ticket. They had the most enjoyable weekend ever, and I spent the weekend distributing resumes and vowing to never be left out like that again. Following my exhausting job search, I was offered a motel night position and worked at the motels for 5 days, from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. every day for 7, and if not more. This job was not incredibly difficult, but it had two components: complete monotony or the most bizarre thing you've ever witnessed. I witnessed a man in the parking lot, walking naked and doing some uri in there as if it was nothing. It took me a minute to realize that he was sleepwalking, or better still, sleep-peeing and not completely out of his mouth. On a different occasion, I witnessed two drag queens fighting and sparring with each other. After putting down his oversized wallet, one of them then threw himself at the other person, who was rolling around on their ground when a small dog emerged from the purse and ran away into the darkness, yawning. Upon disobeying each other, the two drag queens stood up and followed their dog, running away with shouting and then returning to their respective dogs. I never had the chance to see either of them again. It's possible that I had them, but I didn't recognize them. As I stated earlier, the job accounted for around 10% of the total time, while the remaining 90% was filled with unimaginable ineptitude, something that no human being has ever truly encountered. Between the fall and winter of 2006 and 2007, I read more books than I did during my entire school years. On the night I had my gun pointed at me, I was reading a book. The check-in area door was opened when I heard it 30 minutes after midnight. I read my book and noticed a young man walking towards my desk. Despite his dad's typical demeanor, the man has a peculiar smile that looks almost creepy. It seemed like he was coercing it. He didn't seem as friendly as he did, and his heavy breathing made him seem like a threat. Standing at the desk, he gave me an odd-looking smile and asked if there was a couple who had checked in just 10 minutes ago. After describing the couple in great detail, he quickly loses his composure when I inform him that I cannot disclose anything like that. That was not entirely truthful. I was not restricted from sharing information, but I didn't want to discourage it, so I declined. He then switches to calling me an emergency number. Due to his inability to connect with people on their phones, he has been driving all the way here, blah blah. Once more, I gave him a proper response and the most sincere apology I could think of, as he was correct. A couple had walked in just a few hours earlier, one of whom was exactly like the description he had given me. Even though I hadn't computed the numbers, I was still apprehensive about telling the truth to him. He repeated his request, saying, "I'm asking you to do me good." When I refused once more, he took the gun. The likelihood of him entering the room with the couple and killing them was high if I informed him about their location. If I were to give him a number of empty rooms and he started shooting through the window without warning, I'll have their blood on my hands for the rest of my life. As the guy counting down from 10 to reveal that he's going to impress my mother by pretending to be in one of his dirty motel rooms, I must try to remember which ones are empty. My mind is filled with an intense longing to reveal the truth, so I can spare myself and those who are not involved in what I believe to be a violent case of marital disloyalty. I'm feeling a bit crazy, thinking 17 isn't even close to being real, but if it's not, then I might be dead. Upon reaching 3 on his slow execution or countdown style, I can simply commit to it. I inform him that they are located in room 17, but please refrain from taking my life. A boy receives a genuine and renewed smile from him as he tells me. As soon as he leaves the check-in area, I enter the back office, secure the door, and call the police. With the aid of small monitors, we were able to observe the parking lot and entrances to the rooms while I called 911, allowing me to keep an eye on the man's actions. He proceeded towards room 17 and proceeds to smash the door, shouting. The light may not come on as the first person to open it will likely be hit by a bullet, but my ability to pick out an empty room is one of the reasons why it's not happening. I had the impression that it could potentially save us a lot of time, but in truth, it only saved us for about 10 seconds. The man with a sharp smile suddenly appears to be out of nowhere in room 17, walking back and forth in the parking lot. Although his words are not clear, he is still ranting and raving from the office until it's too late. A shot in the air is fired by him, possibly to make a point. But that's what awakened my boss. He was the most chubby person I'd ever met in my lifetime. Can you recall the drag queen dogfight that I mentioned earlier? He managed to sleep through the entire thing. It seemed like he would be wearing his underwear and raising his voice at them, but fortunately a man didn't. He managed to sleep through it. Nevertheless, upon hearing the gunshot, there was an upbeat response in the room, the chamber where my boss slept. The sound of his footsteps from his bed towards the entrance overlooking the parking lot made me almost certain that he was about to be shot. The guy's return to the check-in area caused me to feel frightened, as I suspected he might come back to take revenge for lying to me. The office door is unlocked and there's only one thin door. The second big bang was heard by me, and if I climb up high enough, I can crawl out of that one small room. It wasn't until that moment that the bang was followed by a different kind of screaming from the parking lot. It was definitely the same man who aimed his firearm at me, but he's not screaming in frustration. He's wailing in what appeared to be quite an agonizing moment. After exiting his room upstairs, my boss saw someone walking towards the office with a gun and took the first step. His gun was not a firearm, that's the only thing. The shells were filled with rock salt, while the vessel was a 12-gauge vessel with 2 barrels. Despite being placed in cuffs by the police, the man was still screaming in pain and became a bloody mess when the EMT arrived. My supervisor had almost finished shooting me in the face, causing numerous rock salt crystals to burst out from the wound. I believe that the shots would have only caused him to feel scared at a close range. I'd be surprised if he could recover his complete eyesight after the damage. I inquired my boss about the reason behind using rock salt, but he didn't. Within seconds of asking the question, I realized it was a nonsensical one. He stated that it won't result in death, but it causes pain. The truth was that he had the right idea. The guy's screams caused him to become disoriented and weak, eventually becoming nothing but a mess. Pain like that is something I don't want to endure for the rest of my life. After a few months, I continued to work at that motel until I found secluded employment that didn't involve bloodletting. Regaining the daylight was a pleasant experience, but I'll keep it brief. I never felt more secure while working at the check-in desk, without the added weight of being in a heavy, overweight bed in the room above me. The day I escaped from my violent ex-boyfriend, I ended up at a small motel in Cooper County, Missouri. I had been putting in a lot of effort, saving up books for each trip. I packed my bags, booked a taxi to cab, and left St. Louis the next day when I had enough money and knew I would be out all day. It was no longer just that I had the fear of being killed, but he was actually getting ready to do it. Despite my numerous statements, I was aware of his deep-seated hatred towards me. Despite the apparent pleasure in his actions, they were all tactics used to make me feel inferior. Nevertheless, I was aware that he hadn't fully permitted me to depart. He was envious. The majority of his actions, even those that seemed pleasant on the surface, were simply acts of desperation and repulsion. Nevertheless, I was aware that he hadn't fully permitted me to depart. He was envious of everything, including every little thing. There's no question that he was the most bitter person I've ever met, and after biting my head into the fridge one day, I decided it was time for something good. After years of trying to distance myself from my mother, I called her and pleaded with her to let me stay at her house, and she agreed. Following that, I simply rested and waited for the day to commence, audio-wise, so I was off to my destination. During the entire drive, I was visibly emotional and couldn't sleep for an entire night. It took 3 to 4 hours on the road before I became too overwhelmed to drive. My desire was to avoid car repairs and hospitalization, as my ex would be the first to hear about it. I stopped at the first motel I encountered, parked my car, booked a room, and took ill-conditioned showers to wash away nervous sweat from my clothes. Just so you know, I was kind of joking about it. To be honest, it was incredibly repulsive. I'm still a bit wired after the shower, so I take out some things like my phone charger and sachets of aspirin. While looking through one of the small side pockets in my suitcase, I experience an unfamiliar sensation. Initially, I believed it might be one of my ex's sobriety chips, which he had abandoned before I attempted to leave. My fear caused me to almost abandon the item when I retrieved it and realized what it was. The object was an AirTag, a small tool that aids in finding lost keys or wallets. I had it in my car belonging to my ex. I packed everything into my suitcase, put on some clothes when my hair was still damp, and then ran out to the rental store after leaving the AirTag on the nightstand. My ex started bombarding my phone with calls and messages shortly after getting back on the road, and I was aware of this for a few minutes. Although I hadn't intended to repeat it, they were some of the least offensive things I had ever heard or read about. They were wild and frantic, but there was one thing that stood out. He knew he was going to kill me when he was aware of my location and came to see me. There was just one matter. Did I miss my motel? One of the most insincere methods my ex used to control me was by persuading me to renew my license. He would give me a ride when I needed to go anywhere, or I could opt for an Uber if I ventured outside without him. That was my setup for a considerable duration. There wasn't any freedom, self-respect, or even a plan for me to exit this deep hole in which I fell. My ex believed that I had obtained a car or cab to the motel, but he didn't take into account that my escape plan had already been executed. My ex was under the impression that I couldn't renew my license without his knowledge, as the license and paperwork would be delivered to the apartment. I had to work only part-time to keep up with expenses, which was possible because gas and food prices had risen, giving me the opportunity to send documentation to my workplace. The part-time payoff implies that I could afford the fees, which would eliminate the need for my ex to ask for money. The principle was that I could ask for money whenever I wanted, but the amount I received was entirely dependent on my ex's comprehension of my requirements. With all the price increases in the market, having my own money was like a necessary evil punishment for him. It was unappealing to him, but he couldn't afford to pay for all my things anymore, so it had to be done. In case anyone else thinks that I was ungrateful, it's safe to assume that his false generosity was just another attempt at dominance. I had enough money to cover the fees and other expenses, including motel funds, so I headed to rent a car. The thought of an Uber arriving before his expected arrival and the possibility of a runoff into the surrounding countryside was deeply hurtful for my ex, especially in this mid-January. I was assumed to have been tamed, and he was so happy about the thought that his text could be taken as a sign of his content. I didn't uncover them as I was driving, but almost all other incidents started with law or el mao or ha-ha. It was a relief that I wasn't distracted, as it would have been difficult to avoid texting him with phrases like, "I'm not there, you effing psycho, but your AirTag." It was better for me to just refrain from speaking. Upon arriving at the motel, I discovered that his idea of being a sneaky stalker was not as perverted as he had assumed. Although I've improved in my life since leaving a toxic relationship, I have never experienced anything more terrifying than pulling at an airbag and discovering that the man was after me. To be honest, I aspire to avoid feeling that level of terror once more. My adult life has been marked by 3 flights that included destinations on my bucket list, which were European or Asian. The only reason I was able to handle those flights was due to being overexposed to Xanax. I spent my college years in various states, including several at the age of 7, which made traveling home for the holidays a time like watching Tolkien's adventures. I would leave early for Vermont, and then spend 10 hours driving, which usually resulted in me landing somewhere in rural Virginia. Depending on my exhaustion, I'd opt for the least unpleasant motel option, preferably one with a cozy atmosphere nearby, and then sleep in it overnight before returning to my vehicle in the morning. At the end of my second year at UVM, I am driving home for a summer and have found my preferred motel and cozy spot, which I have only visited twice before. The name of the place won't be revealed, but I anticipate that someone will eventually figure it out, since it's a very heartwarming location. I eventually arrive at the motel, pay for my room, and enjoy a late dinner of biscuits and French toast dip. Subsequently, I went back to my room, took a shower, and then watched some small TV. Until I snapped at 11:30 p.m., I stood up from the bed and proceeded to check my bags before lounging in a side pocket for cigarette remnants. I'm embarrassed to report that I started smoking while rooming with a roommate in my sophomore year. It's a revolting behavior, and now I can't help but feel foolish for getting into it. I decided to wean myself before driving home so that I wouldn't have to worry about smoking during the summer, as my parents would have been completely unaware if they found out. It turns out that I wasn't very skilled at weaning, and even as I got to the motel, I still had these nasty cravings for nicotine right before bedtime. Despite my efforts to resist, I ultimately determined that the morning drive was not the right time for a sweaty, sleepless night. I retrieved the pile of smoke that had been crumpled, took my lighter and rode it down the walkway to board a bus for the night. I can't help but wonder if I should have quit sooner, as the sweet nicotine washed up in my bloodstream. Looking back, the idea is almost like a prophetic message. The motel's U-shape, which was a square bracket, was designed to be right-angled instead of curving. While leaning on the railing and looking away, I witness a car roll into the parking lot while sitting on one of the wings. I suspect that an older man exits a light-colored Toyota Camry and goes into his pocket to search for his motel room key. Upon reaching his room on the ground floor, I observe a flash of light in my peripheral vision. The older man and his female companion quickly approached him as he opened his door, and after a brief but subdued exchange, the trio entered the motel room. I'm not suggesting that I possess a situational intuition, but the interaction struck me as highly unusual. The younger couple may have been waiting for him for an extended period and were upset when the pops, uncle, or other individuals arrived to allow them into the motel room. However, there was some suspicion surrounding their approach to the older man, as well as their sudden rush towards him and their gentle easing of his gaze before closing the door behind them. I had reached the last few puffs of my cigarette, so I brushed it off and proceeded to flush it down to the toilet before picking up my phone and walking back out onto the walkway. I didn't think my first call should have been with the police. I was unsure of what I had observed. I would feel like a complete idiot if the police showed up and kicked in the motel room door, which was discovered to be closed due to the female half of the younger couple's urgent need to pee, prompting them to rush into the hostel. However, I was prepared to call 911 if I saw anything else, so I stayed on the walkway and observed the motel room that I had witnessed 3 individuals enter. After a while, I had an idea that came to mind. I could walk to the check-in area, provide a brief summary of the situation, and then ask how many individuals were present in the room. Despite the fact that it was only one person, I suspect the motel didn't comply with no guest policy, which led to me feeling like I was exaggerating and hurting myself. With that in mind, I opted to abandon the idea of asking for the check-in area and returned to my room to try and catch some sleep. Upon turning my back, I heard muffled but excessive noises emanating from a room across the parking lot. I was brought up with a fascination with firearms and immediately recognized the message conveyed. My initial response was to grapple with one of the concrete pillars that supported the upper walkway and call 911 to inform them about some shots being fired. Despite my efforts to see the parking lot from behind the pillar, I was unable to call 911 until the door of the 3 individuals had broken open. The male half of the younger couple was the first to run out, and he appeared to be limping, but managed to make it across the parking lot before the female half emerged. She slammed in the face and exited the door that her man had left, but then picked herself up and ran further before the older man who I had seen earlier shot her from the motel room. I backed down behind the pillar and made myself as thin as possible, then spent an excessive amount of time unlocking my phone because of the severe shaking in my hands. Before I could ring and use the phone, I heard two things in quick succession. Initially, I heard the voice of the woman who was believed to have sustained injuries. She yelled out, "I'm pregnant! Please don't kill me!" Despite her attempts to express herself, she was cut off by the second noise I heard, which turned out to be the same shot that killed her. The sound I heard was probably the loudest I've ever experienced, and it wasn't due to a gun of significant caliber being shot at someone who was 30 or 40 yards away, but because of what they had just said. After hearing her words, the older man didn't hesitate to respond. Although I can empathize with the fact that it was a falsehood intended to gain sympathy for someone who seemed as innocent as an elderly man, having him refrain from shooting like that was truly disturbing. I was skeptical, and he didn't have faith in her. Despite her unpregnant appearance, he didn't stop to ask or tell her. While I am aware that some women may not experience symptoms until they are in their third trimester, it's important to keep this in mind. He had faith in her, but he was dissatisfied. The shock of what had occurred was still lingering in my mind when I realized that I hadn't even doubted 911. The number was just on my screen. I also didn't want the man to hear me reporting him to the authorities in case he wanted to go back upstairs and remove any witnesses. The emergency caller ran into my room and then let out a loud scream before sliding under the bed to inform me, "We're on your way." It's accurate to say that time is said to slow down in those circumstances. While handling the 911 call, I remained on the phone with the dispatcher and watched as the minutes go by while waiting for the police to arrive. I was concerned about a potential gunfight, but I assumed the guy gave myself up simply because police were walking him to the car and he seemed completely calm and compliant. I made a mistake by looking at the body of the woman he had shot. I shot her with my fist halfway between her eyes, possibly because the large hole in that part of her head was not supported properly due to the absence of a skull behind. Despite its appearance, it didn't seem real. It appeared to be a prop from the movies, but I'm not sure if it was just an illusion or my brain trying to make me believe that what I saw wasn't real. The EMT arrived and covered her with a white sheet. They refrain from using movie props and instead use them when they are surrounded by cameras. It's been almost 15 years since I saw that woman being killed. Despite my conviction in the Second Amendment and the right of individuals to defend themselves, the act of killing someone was not self-defense. Although the initial shot scared off the male partner in the younger couple, pursuing the girl into the parking lot while she was running away no longer poses a threat to him and is considered murder. Despite the girl's pleas, they went to great lengths to execute her without any hesitation. For as long as I can remember, I've never seen anything as icy as that once, which could be a blessing in disguise. In 2009, I completed my social work degree at UC Berkeley. Since the high school years, I have had a strong passion for working with vulnerable children and families, but the reasons behind it are unclear. I think it's possible to say that my entire experience was due to having a savior complex attitude. For a period of time, I felt it was very satisfying. The one aspect of social work that they fail to disclose is how you develop animosity towards the same individuals you are accused of aiding. It's my belief that around 60% to 70% of the people I worked with in the past year were good-hearted individuals who were unfortunate and often had no recourse to any kind of support. The remaining 30% were also present. Approximately 1/3 of individuals have to draw a parallel between themselves and the phrase from Dante's Divine Comedy that suggests giving up hope for everyone who comes to this place. The individuals who displayed a joyful family act during my visits, yet were evidently neglecting or mistreating their children in private settings, were the worst. The conclusion of those visits would have been entirely different if I had worked for Child Protective Services. I was not, so I had to bite my tongue and carry out my duties, hoping for a response before it became too late. I was almost prepared to crack by the end of year one. Social work is advertised as a profession for those who care, but it's actually more suitable for individuals with no feelings. I expressed to my superior my concerns that I was becoming hostile towards those I had the right to empathize with. I anticipated that the admission would lead me to file for unemployment benefits, but my boss presented a suggestion instead. A parole officer could potentially replace a social worker. If he knew me as well as his name suggested, I would be right on my feet, according to him. I have a clear memory of the statement he made that convinced me as well. You have the option to aid individuals you desire, but if you don't, you are obligated to make their lives miserable. I spent 3 minutes on the CDCR's website searching for a job, which was 12 years ago. The decision to become a parole officer was the most advantageous one I've ever made. My boss was entirely correct in his assessment. The movie portrays parolees, but not all of them. I have a feeling that at least half of the individuals I worked with were from the same social work background. Although they may have made poor choices in their lives, they were still good people who took responsibility and aimed to make a positive impact. Although you strive to maintain a professional relationship with your parolees for obvious reasons, I believe that some of them and someone else could have been our friends. A man in his 60s who goes by the name Smokey was one of them. Although I won't be able to disclose his actual name or personal information, I do believe that Smokey was a very good guy, despite his dark side. It's possible that this could raise my moral concerns when I disclose that Smokey was a murderer who served 35 years in prison. However, it was a fact. The only thing Smokey did was commit a murder that would have resulted in his death. He opted for the preemptive action instead of defending himself. I believe that the individual killed by Smokey was a true scumbag, not someone you would recognize as such. Although I'm not suggesting it was appropriate to take his life, Smokey could have done more harm than good due to the actions he had taken before being locked up. I'm not attempting to justify his actions. He should have been punished for murdering a man, but the man who was released from prison was not the one who entered. During the last 2 assessments, we only consumed root beers and took advantage of the breeze. Smokey was completely clean and avoided alcohol. He worked as a truck driver and was in the process of reconnecting with his long-lost daughter. As the saying goes, he was pure and tranquil, and it seemed that his parole would soon be terminated. During one of our discussions, Smokey brought up a typical topic that we discuss. He often recounted how he had been fortunate to avoid numerous close calls throughout his time in the criminal world. In previous discussions, I had thought it was unnecessary to inquire about these close calls. Ex-con presented me with a sparsely written account of his criminal history, particularly things he had done without consequences. Smokey shared a story with me during one of her final assessments. Technically, it did not mention his illegal activities or any actions I would take against my superiors at that time. To be honest, it was one of the most terrifying accounts I've ever heard. Prior to his conviction for murder, Smokey was employed by a narco-trafficking operation on the West Coast. Although he was initially just muscular, his bosses gradually placed more trust in him as a result of his ability. This could involve guiding a package, meeting with an existing contact, or in this instance, joining. At that point in his career, Smokey had no experience with shooting or stabbing people, let alone taking a life. He would use his hands if he had an issue with someone, and being large enough to prevent conflict meant that only the threat of violence was acceptable. He claimed that his role did not involve being an enforcer. The role required an executioner to carry out the task. He is tasked with entering the office of his superior, who functioned as a front-line organization. He is asked if he knows someone who we'll simply call Babyface. Due to his familiarity with the character of Babyface, he is aware of it. Despite being in his early 20s, Babyface had the appearance of a freshman in high school. He possesses genuine youthful features with no facial hair on his face and stands at 5 inches tall, but still exudes an energetic, childlike attitude. During that time, he had been employed by the traffickers for a few months and then abruptly disappeared from the planet for one day. Doesn't want to access his phone. Was that one of the places he usually went to crash? He was a ghost for the entire day. The shipments of the traffickers began to be picked up as they crossed state lines in Oregon. The boss believed that it was not a coincidence. Babyface was apprehended by the authorities and evidently had sex. There was no other way to describe it. The boss doesn't have any respect for it. Smokey was given a straightforward task: Come across Babyface in a motel situated in the middle of nowhere, lead him out to nip over some trees and walk him to one of the farmer's fields, then shoot him in an unsightly face before cutting his throat with the word rat. It didn't matter if it was on the face or chest. The only word required was rat. I mentioned that Smokey had never clipped anyone before, and the notion that he was a wise man who had made one small error raised doubts. It's safe to say that wasn't ideal. Moreover, this is not Smokey's opinion. He believed that taking action against this person was a risky move that could have resulted in the drug enforcement agency known as the DEA. According to Smokey, it was quite common for them to take some of your shipments and then arrest one or two of their crew on bullcrap charges right before the seizure. The law enforcement officers they seized would silence the police for 24 hours without any action. However, his superiors would perceive him as a mole. The most favorable outcome for the DEA. The snitch is killed, and if their narcotics case is found unsatisfactory, they can initiate a murder investigation. By doing this, you can weaken the organization's structure and morale, making them less agile and more prone to errors. It was Smokey's belief that the tactic being used on them may have been the same, but he also knew that if a person refused to hit Babyface, they would be targeted with bullet holes in the motel. He took the lone necessary step in this scenario, telling them that he could finish it and waiting for further instruction. Finally, the day arrives. Upon awakening, Smokey is instructed to drive away to a motel near Death Valley, which has become quite symbolic in its executions. He's informed that the booking is under a particular name, and he uses it to obtain the key to his room, waiting for 3 hours until Babyface shows up. His superiors were impressed that he had not succumbed to police pressure and had been granted a secret mission in farmer country, which involved fake name check-ins. Smokey jogged with him, instructed him to enter his vehicle, and explained that they would be driving out in the middle of nowhere to retrieve a package. Babyface gets into his car, completely uninformed, and they set off. Smokey drove down a dirt road and then proceeded to shovel the dog into the woods. About 100 yards in, Babyface became aware of what was going on. The shovel was in possession of Smokey, who had the good sense to be carrying it, but he quickly dropped it and proceeded to retrieve his gun from Babyface's grasp while attempting to kill him. His eyes widened as tears streamed down his knees, and he's been weeping uncontrollably for breath. I acknowledge my mistake, but I swore by my honesty and belief in the situation. According to him, the most significant thing about his mother was that begging did not have any impact on him. He assured him that if he provided his mother with her address, she would be given money for medication or medical care. He chose to surrender and watch as his shoulders swelled, feeling like he was giving up on life. After stating the address and zip code, Babyface slumped forward and accepted his destiny without hesitation. He didn't alter his narrative, saying that he must take medication and avoid taking my life. He appeared to have a genuine belief that his potential executioner would hand over money to his mother. His concern for her life was more significant than his own, and Smokey's already waning determination was consumed by the thoughts. After feeling the pistol shake in Smokey's palms, he slowly brought it down and instructed the man to stand. He had never seen anyone so terrified before, and at first, this man was so frightened that he barely felt any fear. He was instructed by Smokey to leave the West Coast and move to a far-off location. His second chance was that if he ever showed his face again, it would result in the death of both his mom and him. Tears of relief were shed by Babyface only once this time. Despite repeatedly thanking Smokey with anecdotes and verbal apology, he disappeared into the woods after one command. Only a few months later, someone did see Babyface again, but it wasn't alive, and it was incredibly problematic for Smokey. One day, Smokey is requested to meet with his manager. Despite not knowing what it is or having any reason to be concerned, he goes to his boss's request. When he gets to his office, everything seems to be going smoothly, but when I go inside, I feel such tension. The man's boss is positioned at his desk with a serious expression, rather than the typical smoke and learn comment box. His boss is furious. Although it was not uncommon to see him like that, the hairs on Smokey's back were more noticeable when two other men were positioned behind his seat in front of his boss. Smokey was greatly apprehensive, as he had been sitting in the hot seat at various points in time, and his surroundings were not ideal. In a room filled with rocking chairs, Smokey sits down and faces the music with fear, her expression similar to that of 10-legged feline. He is asked to describe the day he clipped the baby's face by his boss. Smokey explains that his story was entirely accurate, with the exception of one small detail. When he's done, his boss stays silent for a few seconds, looks at the guy behind her, and then asks Smokey to tell them again. Smokey's heart is pounding like a horse, but he persists in telling the story over and over with great care, particularly in the fictionalized part about killing the baby face. After completing it, there's an additional moment of silence before his boss questions whether you removed his shirt. The boss holds his face in his hands, which is not something that Smokey wanted to hear. Upon taking action, Smokey inquires if she should and reserves the right to remove the man. His superior nods in agreement, urging him to be calm but clarifying that they have some pressing matters to attend to. The information they had obtained suggested that Babyface was not a half-hearted fool who would have preferred to be caught in another prison. He had been a covert enforcer. Smokey's reaction to that was not a fluke. It was all genuine, and his boss scolded him. During that moment, he expressed his desire to have shot the baby face. He believed he was doing the right thing by telling him to get lost, but it seemed like the most significant misstep of his entire life. Despite his significant mistakes, Smokey was not expendable, unlike Babyface or the person they believed he was. Rather than being dishonored, Smokey was given an opportunity to make amends. The boss was concerned that Smokey's decision to bury the man with a tracking device and then face the police as they discovered his body, which could have led to him being dead, rather than hiding out in plain view. Smokey and two of the other individuals in the room had to journey to the location where the undercover officer was buried, excavate him, and transfer him to another location after disposing of any bugs or wires that were attached. Is it a simple question? It is known that Smokey did not go there to dig up the undercover core. He was set to proceed to excavate himself there. Besides, what else can he do? His story would crumble if he attempted to give them the ultimatum, and there would be no hope of him making it out alive. By driving those two guys into farmers' country and buying some time, there was a possibility that he might slip through trees while their backs were turned. To get in and out quickly, they needed to have more than one shovel on their hands. It's possible that Smokey falls to the ground to urinate and doesn't return, or he could use a shovel to get past them before they become aggressive. They have set out, moving north into the farming community beyond the area where Smokey committed the murder of the undercover officer. Due to his inability to remember the exact location, he leads them all the way back to the same place. The excavation commences with one of the men providing assistance and the other person keeping watch. After an hour of digging, they reach a depth of at least 6 feet without any evidence. Smokey says sorry, and the two guys then say they spent an hour or so digging up, but instead bought some stuff from behind and moved to another location to dig. Chaperoning Smokey, one of the enforcers, advises him to think hard before continuing with digging. The man is clearly hostile towards Smokey, who has threatened them with their lives and freedom. He was even instructed to use physical force against him if they were unable to locate the body, as it was just another loose end for them. The digging is resumed by Smokey and another man, who then lets the shovel down and takes a break. The message from Smokey is to keep them informed that he buried the man deeply, making it difficult for dogs to detect his corpse, and that there is only a small amount of digging involved. He is unable to escape the hole as it is too deep for him to leap out and attack. The hole he's in is likely to be his grave, not that of the undercover cop. Upon finding the right burial site, he begins to use other explanations and express confusion about his surroundings and inability to locate him. The two individuals in charge were disinterested. They were interested in someone or something that appeared to be moving towards them from the trees, and shortly after, Smokey heard a loud shouting at the sheriff's apartment. "Please show me your hands." With a pure white-hot rage in his eyes, the man on top turns and puts down his hands before turning to look at Smokey, who then points the gun at him. He fired 3 shots and yelled before being shot by the deputies, who then turned their weapon, The scar on Smokey's leg was caused by one of the bullets, and I saw it with my own eyesight. In the eyes of law enforcement, Smokey was the victim in this case. Despite not disclosing any information to them, they believed he was participating in an illegal scheme, but fortunately, the individual emerged from the hospital uninjured. His colleagues were still under his control, and he was at least free in the legal sense. They have already decided that Smokey was a sort of rat, which is exactly what it looked like. They drove away in the middle of nowhere, with one person being killed, another being pinched, and the last remaining released without charge. It was a highly questionable situation. Instead of attempting to convince his superiors that he was working with law enforcement, Smokey went on the run. He sees someone watching him from the parking lot while staying at a different motel, some distance from Northern California, several weeks later. To ensure his safety, he briefly drove around the town before driving away in an alleyway, exited his car with the engine still running, and concealed himself behind a dumpster. The man behind him blocks him and then comes up to Smokey's car that was not moving. After snatching the gun and his would-be assassin's hand, Smokey looks up, but the guy is still too late. Despite carrying all 6 bullets from a .38 revolver, Smokey fled the scene and was later stopped by armed motorcycle traffic police after she had left the weapon behind. That's how he ended up with over 30 years behind bars, as well as me. Smokey expressed his suspicions, but it is uncertain how the police managed to locate him. He is certain that he wasn't wearing any kind of wire or tracking device, and the person who attempted to kill him was likely not. The third individual appeared to have jumped out of the hole for his escape moments before the police arrived, leading to him being handcuffed instead of being shot. The possibility of that being the case was too slim to be taken seriously. It's conceivable that Smokey gained powerful companionship by refraining from killing Babyface. The group of friends who, like Smokey, volunteered to assist Babyface on that day. I've never met a man quite like that except for Smokey. It is not a lawful, successful person, but good and interesting. Smokey's life and death are characterized by her anonymity. At times, I have a feeling